Hey guys, tonight we are peeling back the millennia, long before the glimmer of silk, before the caravans and the bustling oases, to a time when the so-called silk routes were nothing more than incredibly long, incredibly dangerous walks. Imagine, if you will, the vast, untamed expanse of Central Asia. You're standing on a rocky outcrop, the wind whipping your hair, probably quite greasy hair, by the way, across your face. Before you stretches an endless, dusty plain, shimmering under a relentless sun. There are no roads, no signs, no friendly roadside diners promising the world's best cup of fermented mare's milk. There's just distance, and the vague, desperate hope that something better lies beyond the horizon. Honestly, if you were dropped there with your current skill set, you probably wouldn't survive this. Not a week. Be honest, you complain if the Wi-Fi drops for 5 minutes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really does help the channel, and it makes me feel like I'm not just whispering into the void. You know, go ahead and drop your location and what time it is where you are in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are not a merchant. Not yet. The concept of a merchant prince is so far in the future it's not even a sparkle in humanity's collective eye. You are perhaps a hunter, your small band having tracked game further and further from your usual grounds until the familiar landmarks have vanished behind you like a dream. Or maybe you're part of a family unit, a tiny nomadic group, and the patch of land you've clung to for generations has finally given up. The rains have failed one too many times, and the sparse vegetation has withered to nothing. The elders, their faces like cracked riverbeds, have pointed towards a distant mountain range, a smudge of purple against the pale sky, and muttered something about legends, about water, about survival. And so, you walk. Your feet, wrapped in poorly cured animal hides, are already protesting. Every step is a negotiation with the terrain, loose scree that threatens to send you tumbling, sharp stones that seem to aim for the tenderest part of your soul, and vast stretches of cracked earth that radiate a baking heat. There's no map. Of course, your GPS is the sun, the stars, the prevailing wind, and an inherited, instinctual sense of direction that we, in our modern world, have mostly forgotten how to access. You carry little, a sharpened stone tool, a water skin that never seems to hold enough, perhaps a small, precious bundle of dried berries or roots. The idea of carrying something just to trade it, something you don't immediately need for your own survival, that's a luxury for a more settled, more secure future. Right now, every ounce of energy, every possession, is about making it through the next day. The next valley? You see movement in the distance. Is it game or is it another group? Just as desperate, just as wary as yours? The tension is a cold knot in your stomach. Encounters are rare, and their outcome utterly unpredictable. Will it be a cautious exchange of gestures, a shared moment of relief at seeing another human face? Or will it be suspicion, fear, and a swift, brutal conflict over scarce resources? Historians still argue whether these earliest trans-Eurasian contacts were entirely sporadic and accidental, born of pure desperation, or if they followed dimly remembered generations-old pathways. Whispered knowledge of mountain passes and hidden springs passed down through countless campfires. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, setting off with so little certainty? Just a profound, gnawing need? The primary drivers for these immense unrecorded journeys were the absolute basics: food, water, and slightly less immediate but equally important, resources for tools and shelter, flint for tools, salt for preserving what little meat you might get, safe places to camp away from predators. This is long before anyone is thinking about export markets or balance of trade. This is the raw material of human expansion, the slow, tentative spread of our species across the face of the planet. One of the fascinating mainstream historical facts is that the migration of Homo sapiens out of Africa, tens of thousands of years earlier, followed similar patterns of resource seeking and navigating vast, unknown territories. These later, pre-Silk Road movements across Asia are, in a way, a continuation of that ancient human impulse to explore, to endure, to find what's over there. You might stumble upon an outcrop of rock that contains a seam of particularly good stone for toolmaking, something harder, something that holds an edge longer. This place, this discovery, might become a point of return, a location etched into the collective memory of your small group. Perhaps another group, generations later, will find the discarded remnants of your toolmaking efforts, a subtle clue that this area holds something of value. These aren't trade routes, not by any stretch of the imagination. They are survival tracks, desire lines worn into the earth by the desperate feet of those who came before. It's almost comical to think that the grand, world-changing Silk Road started with someone thinking, ugh, another blister. And all for a slightly less terrible piece of flint. A quirky little tidbit from the annals of things people did to survive is the incredibly ancient evidence of people using natural bitumen, or tar, to attach stone points to wooden shafts for spears or arrows, found in various prehistoric sites. Imagine the trial and error, the sticky fingers, the eureka moment when someone figured out that this black goo could make their hunting tools more reliable. Finding a source of bitumen could be as crucial as finding water. It's these small, forgotten technologies, these incremental improvements, that allowed people to survive slightly better, to perhaps risk slightly longer journeys. It wasn't about comfort, it was about a fractional increase in the odds of not starving or being eaten. The sun begins to dip, painting the sky in hues of orange and bruised purple. The temperature drops with surprising speed. You huddle with your companions for warmth. The silence of the vast landscape broken only by the sigh of the wind or the distant, unnerving cry of an unseen animal. Sleep is a shallow, fitful thing, punctuated by alerts to any sound, any shift in the darkness. You dream of water, of a successful hunt, of a place where the ground is soft and the wind doesn't bite so fiercely. This is the world before the Silk Road. A world of sweat, of dust, of constant grinding effort, with very little to show for it beyond the fact that you've made it through another day. The idea of luxury goods, of shimmering silks and exotic spices, would be an absurd fantasy to you. Huddled here in the encroaching cold, your concerns are far more immediate, far more visceral. And yet, it is from these humble, agonizingly slow beginnings, these really, really long walks, that the seeds of connection, of exchange, and eventually of a world-spanning network were unknowingly sown. You just wouldn't have bet on it at the time, especially if you were out of smoked gazelle jerky. One can only imagine the prehistoric equivalent of a bad Yelp review for a particularly barren stretch of desert. 0 stars, no water, would not wander here again. So, you've survived another bitterly cold night, huddled against the elements, dreaming those fitful dreams of water and warmth we talked about. The sun, that same relentless celestial body, now climbs the sky, promising another day of, well, mostly walking. But something is subtly shifting in the collective mindset of certain groups in certain regions. While the fundamental struggle for food and water, that raw survival instinct that drove those earliest, aimless drifts we imagined in Section 1 certainly hasn't vanished. Far from it. New desires are beginning to flicker into existence. It's no longer just about finding the next meal or a slightly less miserable place to sleep. Specific resources, things that offer more than just caloric intake, are starting to exert a pull. A siren song across the vast, unforgiving landscapes. Two of these nascent desires, these early must-haves that would eventually justify some truly epic treks, are for a particular kind of stone and a particular kind of animal jade and horses. Imagine you're now part of a culture, perhaps nestled in the fertile plains of what will one day be called China. Your society is becoming more complex, with rituals, beliefs, and a nascent hierarchy. And for reasons that are a blend of spiritual significance, aesthetic appreciation, and sheer durability, a stone known as nephrite jade holds an immense fascination. This isn't the sparkly bling you see in a modern jewelry store. This is a tough, subtly beautiful stone, often a deep, resonant green, or sometimes a creamy, almost translucent white, famously known as mutton fat jade. You believe it has protective qualities, that it links the earthly realm to the heavens, that it might even whisper secrets of immortality. The mainstream historical fact here is that jade from regions like Khotan, far to your west, deep in the Tarim Basin on the edges of the formidable Taklamakan Desert, has been found in Chinese archaeological sites dating back to the Neolithic period, thousands of years before the Han Dynasty even conceived of a Silk Road. This means that for millennia, people were undertaking monumentally difficult journeys to acquire this stone. But this jade doesn't just leap into your hand, it's found in riverbeds, often as heavy boulders, or laboriously mined from hard rock deposits in remote, inhospitable mountains. You or someone designated by your group would have to walk and walk and walk for hundreds, maybe thousands of miles into territories unknown and likely unfriendly. Remember those sharp stones underfoot and that gnawing hunger from our general wanderings. Now amplify that, because you're not just looking for any rock, you're looking for the rock. And once you find it, you have to haul these hefty, unworked chunks of jade all the way back. No wheeled carts optimized for this yet. No convenient pack animals in widespread use for such specific, long-distance luxury cargo. It's human muscle, human sweat, human endurance. Imagine the sheer, bloody-minded determination required. You're not doing this for a quick snack. You're doing this for something your culture has imbued with profound spiritual and social value. It's the kind of task that makes you question your life choices. Probably somewhere around the third mountain range when your sandals have disintegrated and you're eyeing your companions with a who gets eaten first if the berries run out kind of look. Then there are the horses. If your people are more settled, agricultural, you're likely bumping up against nomadic groups who seem to live on horseback. Their horses are swift, hardy, and give them a distinct advantage in mobility, whether for hunting, migrating, or the occasional unfriendly raid on your burgeoning grain stores. You look at your own local ponies, perhaps smaller, a bit more, let's say, domestically inclined, and you feel a distinct sense of equine inadequacy. The desire for better horses, for heavenly horses, as they would later be called, becomes a powerful motivator. These aren't just for pulling a plow a bit faster. These are about security, about projecting power, about having the ability to respond quickly to threats or to expand your own influence. Some of the most prized horses came from regions like the Fergana Valley, nestled in Central Asia, renowned for steeds that were larger, faster, and possessed greater stamina than many of the breeds available closer to the heartlands of ancient China. So, you set out, not with the vague hope of finding something, but with the specific goal of acquiring these superior animals. This might involve trading, perhaps grain, pottery, or other goods your settled society produces in surplus. But what have you got that a fiercely independent horse nomad truly needs from you? Besides more horses, historians still argue whether the earliest acquisition of these prized animals was through organized trade missions, however rudimentary, or more often the result of conflict, raiding, or the opportunistic capture of strays. It's a complex picture. You can picture the scene trying to haggle for a prize stallion when you don't speak the language, and your only universally understood currency is a slightly desperate smile and pointing. Me want big horsey, you want shiny pot. It probably didn't always go smoothly. One quirky tidbit about ancient horse trading, or perhaps horse desiring, comes from the general human tendency to value rarity and perceived unique qualities. Sometimes a horse's unusual color, or a particular marking, or even just a reputation perhaps entirely fabricated by a wily seller for being unbreakable or tireless, could elevate its value enormously. Think of it as the ancient world's equivalent of paying extra for a limited edition sneaker. There were no Carfax reports for used war horses, so a good story could be just as valuable as strong legs. You might walk 500 miles for a horse that was legendary, only to find it was legendary for its bad temper and ability to throw its rider into the nearest thorn bush. Buyer beware. Even in 2000 BCE, these pursuits, jade for the soul and status, horses for power and survival, begin to etch more defined, albeit still incredibly perilous, pathways across the land. They are not roads in any sense we would recognize. They are lines of desire, invisible threads of human will cast out over enormous distances. The individuals undertaking these journeys are still facing the same blistering sun, the same freezing nights, the same dangers from bandits, beasts, and barren landscapes as those merely drifting for survival. But now there's a specific high-value target in mind. This changes the calculation, justifies greater risks, and perhaps fosters a more specialized kind of knowledge which mountain passes are seasonally viable. Where the hostile tribes are less likely to be, which rare oases can be relied upon. It's the beginning of a specialized knowledge, the kind that old mate who knows a guy for cheap electronics has. But for life-or-death desert crossings, the sweat is still there, copious amounts of it, but it's now mingled with the glint of a dream. The dream of Jade's cool, spiritual touch, or the dream of thundering across the plains on a creature that feels like an extension of your own ambition. All right, so you've now got a sense of these early, determined trudges across vast landscapes, not just for basic survival like in our earliest imaginings, but for those alluring greenstones, jade, and those powerful, almost mythical horses we touched upon in Section 2. These journeys, born of desire and necessity, were already etching faint lines into the earth, tentative connections between disparate peoples. But these were largely individual or small group efforts, driven by localized needs or the ambitions of a particular clan. Now, imagine the stakes getting a bit higher, the scope a bit wider. We're moving into a period where a centralized power, the burgeoning Han dynasty in China, starts to look west. Not initially for shiny trinkets or exotic groceries, but for strategic advantage. And this is where you meet a man whose story is a cornerstone of the Silk Road's origin myth, Zhang Xian. Though, to be fair, when he set out, he probably wasn't thinking. Yes, I shall now go invent a major global trade network. His reality was far more complicated. You are Zhang Qian, or at least you're with him, part of his 100-strong entourage. It's around 138 BCE, and the Han Emperor Wu has a bit of a problem. That problem is a powerful confederation of nomadic tribes to the north and west called the Xiongnu. They are, to put it mildly, a persistent thorn in the side of the Han Empire, raiding, demanding tribute, and generally being excellent horsemen who are very hard to pin down. Think of them as the ultimate uninvited house guests who also happen to be really good at archery from horseback. Emperor Wu has a plan, or at least a hopeful strategy to find allies. He's heard whispers that another group, the Yuezhi, who were previously thumped by the Xiongnu and pushed far to the west, might be persuaded to join forces with the Han to exact some revenge. Your mission, as part of Zhang Qian's diplomatic envoy, is to find the Yuezhi and propose this grand anti-Xiongnu alliance. Sounds like a straightforward diplomatic mission. Right, a long walk. Sure, but with an imperial mandate. What could go wrong? Well, pretty much everything, almost immediately. As you and Zhang Qian venture out from the Han territory, beyond the westernmost outpost of Longxi, you don't get very far before, surprise, you're captured by the Xiongnu. Yes, the very people you're trying to build an alliance against. Awkward. This isn't a brief interrogation and a slap on the wrist. Zhang Qian, and you by extension, are detained for about 10 years. 10 years. That's a significant chunk of a man's life to spend as an involuntary guest. During this time, Zhang Qian is given a Xiongnu wife, with whom he has a child, and he learns a great deal about their customs, their language, and their territory. It's not exactly the diplomatic progress Emperor Wu was hoping for, but it's an unparalleled intelligence gathering opportunity, albeit one that came with a rather steep personal price. You can imagine him thinking, well, this isn't for Ghana, but the yurt life has a certain rustic charm. No, just me. But Zhang Qian is nothing if not persistent. After a decade, he sees his chance and escapes, along with his Yongnu wife and a loyal aide named Ganfu. And does he head straight back home? Mission spectacularly failed, no. He presses on westward, still determined to find the Yueji. This is where his journey turns from a failed diplomatic mission into an epic of exploration. You trudge with him through incredibly harsh terrains, across deserts and over mountain ranges that would make even our earlier jade seekers and horse traders pause. He eventually reaches Daywan in the Fergana Valley. And yes, remember that desperate yearning for superior horses we discussed? Zhang Qian sees them. The famed heavenly horses. Or blood-sweating horses. And he's suitably impressed. This is a mainstream historical fact. Zhang Qian's reports about these magnificent Fergana horses would later become a major impetus for Han military expeditions to secure them. From Daiwan, he continues, passing through the lands of the Kangju people, and finally, he finds the Yuezhi, now settled in Bactria, north of the Oxus River, modern-day Amu Darya. Success, except not quite. The Yuezhi, having found a nice, fertile land to settle in, are prosperous and, frankly, not very interested in picking another fight with the Yongnu, who are now a very distant problem for them. They politely decline Zhang Qian's alliance proposal. It's the ancient world equivalent of, thanks, but we're good. Don't call us, we'll call you. So, after all that, the primary objective is a bust. The journey back is no picnic either. Zhang Qian attempts a different route to avoid the Xiongnu. But guess what? He gets captured by them again. Seriously. This guy's luck with the Xiongnu was impressively bad. He spends another year in captivity before, once again, managing to escape during a period of internal turmoil among his captors. Finally, in 126 BCE, after 13 years, Zhang Qian, his Xiongnu wife, and Ganfu make it back to the Han capital. Chang'an. Of the original 100-plus members of the mission, only these few return. Now, while he failed in his diplomatic mission, Zhang Qian brought back something arguably far more valuable information. Detailed accounts of the kingdoms he visited, the peoples he encountered, their customs, their products, the routes to reach them. He spoke of sophisticated urban cultures in Central Asia, of goods he'd never seen before, and, crucially, of their potential interest in Chinese goods. He didn't exactly come back with a shopping list for silk, but his reports opened the Han court's eyes to a world beyond their previously known frontiers. Historians still argue whether Zhang Qian's reports perhaps subtly exaggerated the wealth and receptiveness of these Western kingdoms to deliberately spur Han imperial ambitions and justify further expeditions, or if he was simply a meticulous, objective observer relaying what he saw. Given the man endured 2 multi-year stints as a prisoner of the people he was trying to undermine, you'd think he'd be pretty motivated to get some imperial action heading west. One quirky tidbit that often gets mentioned is that Zhang Qian is credited with introducing, or at least bringing back knowledge of alfalfa and wine grapes to China. These weren't state secrets or treasures of immense value at the time, but they had a lasting impact on Chinese agriculture. Imagine him presenting these to the emperor. Well, the alliance thing didn't pan out, and I was a prisoner for, a decade. But hey, check out this new plant for feeding horses. And these berries, you can crush them and they make this interesting juice. It's a small thing, but it illustrates the often unintended consequences of these incredible journeys. Zhang Qian set out to find allies. He ended up becoming a pivotal figure in sketching the very first tentative lines of what would, centuries later, blossom into the Silk Road. His accidental adventure, born of political necessity and personal tenacity, provided the crucial intel and, perhaps more importantly, the imperial curiosity that would begin to transform those really long walks into something much more structured and significant. So, Zhang Xian, our rather unlucky but ultimately very informative envoy, makes it back to Chang'an, as we saw in Section 3. He spilled the beans about the kingdoms of the West, the potential for alliances even if his first attempt was a bit of a diplomatic own goal, and those rather fetching heavenly horses. You'd imagine the Han Emperor, after hearing all this, would immediately commission a 6-lane superhighway, complete with service stations and perhaps a loyalty card program for frequent travelers. Right? Well, not quite. The imperial court was certainly intrigued, and Zhang Qian's reports did spark further expeditions and a more focused westward gaze. But the actual roads, or rather the faint, tentative pathways, didn't just spring into existence overnight. They emerged slowly, almost accidentally, etched into the vast, indifferent earth by the repeated passage of desperate, hopeful, or simply curious feet. You are now part of this next wave, not necessarily an imperial envoy, but perhaps a trader with a bit of daring, or a nomad whose traditional routes are starting to see more varied traffic, or even just someone driven by the age-old human itch to see what's over the next mountain range. Those earlier motivations we talked about, the spiritual pull of jade from Khotan, the strategic need for those superior Central Asian horses, are still very much in play. People are still making those incredibly long walks for those specific desires. But now, there's an added layer, a hazy awareness, thanks to Zhang Qian's intelligence, that other organized societies exist out there. Societies that might have interesting things. Societies that might even want some of your things. Though what those things are is still a matter of much experimentation. These pathways are not roads in any modern sense. Forget asphalt. Forget signposts. There are no neatly paved surfaces or scenic route options advertised on weathered wooden signs. Think instead of desire lines, those informal tracks people create by repeatedly walking the most direct or easiest way across a patch of ground. Now, scale that concept up to continental size. You're following riverbeds because they offer water and often a flatter gradient. You're threading your way through mountain valleys because the alternative is an impossible climb over a jagged peak. You're hopping from one meager oasis to the next in the desert, not because it's a pleasant journey, but because it's the only way to avoid becoming a permanent, sun-dried feature of the landscape. It's like nature's own brutalist version of a connect-the-dots puzzle, where the dots are life-sustaining water sources. The road is as much a collection of shared knowledge as it is a physical track. It's the elder in your group who remembers a grandfather talking about a particular pass that's only free of snow for 2 months of the year. It's the trader you meet by chance at a waterhole who warns you away from a certain valley, muttering about bandits or a local chieftain with a penchant for unofficial tolls. This knowledge is precious, hard-won, and often paid for in hardship or lives. You're essentially crowdsourcing your route, one dangerous encounter and whispered conversation at a time. Ancient Google Maps, it is not. It's more like a really high-stakes game of telephone played across generations. And how are these paths etched through sheer repetition? Enough people choosing the same slightly less treacherous goat track over a mountain? Enough pack animals where they were used compacting the earth along a certain stretch of steppe? Enough campfires leaving their blackened scars near a reliable spring? Occasionally, but you might see a small cairn of stones, a pile deliberately made by a previous traveler to mark a particularly confusing junction or the beginning of a difficult descent. In some more forested areas, if you ever found yourself in such luxury, perhaps a blaze on a tree. But for the most part, especially in the vast arid regions of Central Asia, the markers are more subtle, a particular configuration of distant peaks, the way the sun hits a certain cliff face in the afternoon, the almost imperceptible shift in vegetation that hints at underground water. A mainstream historical fact is that many of these early routes followed what archaeologists call lines of least resistance, dictated by topography and water availability, and these routes often show evidence of use stretching back into prehistory, long before any organized Silk Road trade. The accidental nature of these emerging pathways is key. There's no central planning committee deciding that a B road needs to be upgraded to an A road. A route might become popular for a few years or decades because a particular oasis is reliable, or a local tribe is relatively friendly to traders. Then the climate might shift, the oasis might dry up, or a new, more aggressive chieftain might take over, and suddenly that reliable route is a death trap. The pathways would then shift, like water finding a new course. Flexibility and adaptability are paramount. You learn to read the land, the sky, the subtle signs of human and animal passage. One quirky, though perhaps not entirely pleasant, tidbit is the undeniable usefulness of animal dung. In arid landscapes, dried dung from pack animals or herds could be a vital sign of a recently used trail, and of course a crucial source of fuel for fires where wood was non-existent. Finding a relatively fresh deposit could mean the difference between a cold, lonely night and a warmish, slightly less lonely one. It's not glamorous, but survival rarely is. You are, in essence, a pioneer, whether you intend to be or not. Every successful journey, every return with goods or information, reinforces the viability of a certain sequence of tracks. Every group that vanishes without a trace serves as a grim, unspoken warning. Historians still argue whether the initial choice and persistence of specific transcontinental routes were primarily dictated by these unavoidable geographical constraints, the mountains and deserts simply leaving no other options, or whether they were more heavily influenced by the territories of powerful nomadic groups, whose tolerance, hostility, or demands for tribute effectively shaped the feasible corridors for travel and trade. It was likely a complex interplay of both. You might have the perfect mountain pass on your mental map, but if it's controlled by a tribe that views travelers as mobile shopping opportunities, you're going to find another way, even if it adds weeks to your journey. It's a slow, organic process. These accidental pathways emerging from the dust and desperation, there's no fanfare, no ribbon-cutting ceremonies, just the whisper of wind over endless plains, the crunch of feet on gravel, and the silent, enduring hope that the path you've chosen, the one faintly suggested by those who walked before, will lead you somewhere other than to your own demise. You're not just carrying goods, you're carrying information in your very footsteps, contributing one more faint impression to the gradually deepening groove that will, one day, be recognized as a road. So you've navigated those emerging accidental pathways we discussed in Section 4, those faint traces on the earth slowly being reinforced by more and more feet, driven by the whispers of jade, the need for good horses, or perhaps the intriguing reports from fellows like Zhang Qian. You're feeling pretty good about yourself, maybe even a little bit like a seasoned traveler. You've learned to read the subtle signs, to anticipate a tricky river crossing, perhaps even to haggle for a slightly less bruised piece of fruit at a tiny settlement. But now, looming before you, is a challenge that makes all previous hardships seem like a pleasant stroll in a particularly unkempt park. You stand at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert. Its very name, depending on the Uyghur dialect and translation, whispers a warning, go in, and you will not come out. Or the place of no return. Or sometimes, more poetically, the land of irrevocable desolation. Catchy. Right, not exactly prime real estate for a holiday cottage. This isn't just any desert, it's one of the largest sandy deserts in the world. A vast oval sea of shifting dunes locked in the Tarim Basin, bordered by towering mountain ranges. The Tian Shan to the north, the Kunlun to the south, the Pamirs to the west. Those accidental pathways we talked about around the Taklamakan, they weren't so much accidental as desperately clinging to the absolute last-ditch option for survival, forming two main branches that skirted its northern and southern rims, hugging the foothills where meltwater from the mountains created a string of life-giving oases. To attempt a direct crossing was, for most, unthinkable. You take a deep breath, and the air itself feels different. Parched, abrasive, carrying the finest, almost invisible particles of sand that will soon find their way into everything: your eyes, your mouth, your water skin, the very fabric of your already tattered clothing. The scale of it is overwhelming. Before you, the world dissolves into an undulating expanse of yellow, ochre, and pale tan, stretching to a horizon that shimmers and dances with heat haze. The silence is profound, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind as it sculpts the dunes into ever-changing, knife-edged crests and deep, shadowed bowls. It's a silence that can press in on you, making the frantic beat of your own heart sound like a drum. You know you're in trouble when even the tumbleweeds, if there were any, would look profoundly depressed by the sheer emptiness. Your journey now becomes a desperate calculation of water. The oases are days, sometimes many days, apart. Every drop in your water skin is more precious than any jade you might be seeking. Thirst becomes your constant companion, a dry, rasping insistence in your throat, a stickiness on your tongue. The sun climbs, a merciless white disk in a pale sky, and the heat becomes a physical weight, pressing down on you, leaching the moisture from your body. Sweat evaporates almost instantly, leaving your skin tight and crusted with salt. Mirages flicker in the distance, cool, inviting lakes, lush palm groves, cruel illusions that can lure the unwary or the desperate off course to their doom. You learn to distrust your own eyes, to rely on the grim experience of your guide, if you're lucky enough to have one who has actually survived this before. And then there are the dust storms. They can appear with terrifying speed, a roiling wall of yellow-black cloud that engulfs everything. The wind howls, visibility drops to zero, and the air becomes a choking, blinding maelstrom of sand. All you can do is huddle down, cover your face, and pray that your animals don't bolt in terror, and that you don't get buried alive or lose your companions. It's like being sandblasted by a particularly malevolent deity who's also using a wind machine cranked up to 11. After a storm passes, the landscape can be utterly transformed. Familiar dunes gone, new ones created, making navigation even more treacherous. The psychological toll is immense. Days of trudging through an apparently featureless landscape, with only the distant, hazy promise of mountains to guide you, can erode even the strongest will. Disorientation is a constant threat. Getting lost here doesn't just mean a delay, it means almost certain death. You see bleached bones, the skeletal remains of animals that didn't make it, and perhaps, if you're particularly unlucky, the grisly, desiccated evidence of human travelers who succumbed to the desert's embrace. These are stark, silent warnings, far more eloquent than any written sign. One of the most compelling and somewhat eerie mainstream historical facts about this region is the discovery of the Tarim mummies, astonishingly well-preserved human remains, some dating back almost 4,000 years, found on the desert's edges. Many of these mummies have Caucasoid features, wearing woolen textiles, indicating a surprisingly early and diverse population in and around the Tarim Basin, long before the Han Dynasty became interested in the area. Their existence speaks volumes about the ancient human presence in this unforgiving environment. There's a quirky and frankly terrifying tidbit found in some ancient accounts of the Taklamakan: tales of strange sounds, whispers, and musical notes carried on the wind, said to be the voices of demons or spirits attempting to lure travelers astray from their caravans and off the correct paths, leading them to perish in the dunes. While easily attributable to wind effects, auditory illusions in the vast emptiness, or the simple effects of heat stroke and dehydration on the mind. Imagine hearing such things when you're already pushed to your physical and mental limits. Historians still argue whether the dominant fear and dread associated with the Taklamakan in ancient texts and travelers' tales was due more to its genuinely extreme physical perils, which were and are undeniably severe, or if it was amplified by a culturally constructed horror, a reputation built and embellished by storytellers and the sheer unnerving mystery of its vast, sandy emptiness. Yet when people did cross it, or at least skirt its perilous edges, the oases, fed by rivers like the Tarim, the Khotan, and the Yarkand, were the keys. These were islands of green in a sea of sand, offering water, food, and shelter. Towns and small kingdoms like Khotan, Kashgar, Yarkand on the southern rim, and Kucha, Aksu, and Turpan on the northern rim became vital staging posts. They were the beads on the fragile thread of the route. Reaching one after days in the sand sea was like being reborn, but even these oases were sometimes threatened by the encroaching desert or by shifting political sands. This desert, the Sea of Death, was a crucible, testing the limits of human endurance and the strength of those emerging connections. It filtered out the weak, the unlucky, and the ill-prepared, ensuring that only the most determined, or perhaps the most desperate, made it through. And every successful passage, however brutal, reinforced the knowledge that it could be done, adding another layer of grim experience to the growing map of these long, long walks. So you've somehow managed to not become a permanent, sand-blasted art installation in the Taklamakan Desert, a fate we contemplated with a fair amount of dread in Section 5. You've successfully navigated its treacherous, oasis-dotted rim. Your skin probably several shades darker and drier. Your canteen perpetually feeling half empty. You're likely thinking, surely that was the worst of it? Plain sailing from here on out? Maybe a few rolling hills. A pleasant babbling brook or two. Oh, you sweet, optimistic, and slightly dehydrated traveler. Look up. Looming before you, often scratching the belly of the sky itself, are the colossal mountain ranges of Central Asia, the Pamirs, the Tian Shan, the Kunlun, the Karakoram, the Hindu Kush. Collectively, a magnificent, terrifying barrier often referred to as the roof of the world. And if your long walk is taking you further west or southwest, you're going to have to find a way through them. This isn't like a picturesque hike in a national park with well-marked trails and a charming little tea shop at the summit. These are some of the highest, most rugged mountain systems on the planet. Imagine jagged, snow-capped peaks sawing at the sky, immense glaciers inching their way down desolate valleys, and sheer rock faces that plummet for thousands of feet. The very air up here feels different, thin, cold, and unforgiving. You're entering a world where human beings are very much not the dominant species. You are an intruder, tolerated only briefly and at great risk. Those faint, accidental pathways we spoke of earlier become even more critical, even more life or death in this vertical realm. The first thing that hits you, often before you even gain significant altitude, is the sheer, relentless effort of upward travel. Every step is a battle against gravity, especially if you're leading heavily laden pack animals, assuming you still have any. Then, as you climb higher, the air thins. This isn't just a poetic description, it's a physical reality. Your lungs burn, desperate for oxygen that simply isn't there in the accustomed quantity. Headaches become a constant, dull throb behind your eyes. Nausea churns in your stomach. You feel a profound, bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest seems to alleviate. This is altitude sickness, what ancient travelers would have simply called mountain madness or bad air. With no understanding of the physiological processes but a very keen appreciation of its debilitating effects. It could make strong men weak, clear thinkers confused, and turn a manageable trek into a fight for survival. Some folks back then probably thought it was mountain spirits messing with their heads. And honestly, given the hallucinations some people get, it's not an entirely unreasonable assumption. And then there's the cold. It's a piercing, insidious cold that seeps into your bones, made worse by the ever-present wind that whips through the high passes, finding every gap in your inadequate clothing. Frostbite is a constant menace, turning fingers, toes, ears, and noses into numb, blackened liabilities. You huddle together at night, trying to share warmth, but sleep is often a fitful, shivering affair. water sources freeze solid, food, already scarce, becomes even harder to find. The landscape is stark, often above the tree line, offering little fuel for fires beyond what meager shrubs you might find, or, if you're lucky, dried animal dung. Just imagine trying to light a fire with numb fingers in a howling gale at 15,000 feet. It's not exactly a cozy campfire sing-along. The paths themselves are terrifying. Forget wide, graded tracks. You're often on narrow ledges, barely wide enough for a single person or animal, with a sheer drop on one side into a seemingly bottomless abyss. Loose scree can send you skidding. A misplaced step can be fatal. Rockfalls are a common danger, dislodged by wind, frost, or the passage of animals above. In winter and spring, the threat of avalanches is ever present. A sudden, terrifying roar and a river of snow, ice, and rock thundering down the mountainside, capable of obliterating everything in its path. Crossing glaciers means navigating treacherous crevasses, hidden slots in the ice that can swallow a person or animal whole. And then there are the rivers born from melting glaciers. They are often raging torrents of icy water, powerful enough to sweep away even the strongest. Fording them is a life-threatening exercise. A significant mainstream historical fact is the presence of numerous ancient petroglyphs, rock carvings, and inscriptions found in many of these high-altitude passes, such as the Mintaka or Kalik passes in the Pamirs, or along the Karakoram Highway, which follows ancient routes. These carvings, left by traders, pilgrims, warriors, and migrating peoples over millennia, depict animals, hunting scenes, religious symbols, and sometimes just names or greetings. They are silent testimony to the countless souls who braved these formidable barriers long before recorded history. Each carving is a whisper from the past, a tiny mark of human passage in an overwhelmingly inhuman landscape. So why on earth would anyone attempt this? Because for many of the desired routes, especially those aiming for Bactria, Sogdia, Persia, or the Indian subcontinent from the Tarim Basin, where Zhang Qian found the Yuezhi. Remember, these mountain ranges were an unavoidable obstacle. The passes, though hellish, were the only chinks in the armor. Knowledge of these passes, their seasonality, their dangers, the disposition of any local tribes controlling them, was incredibly valuable. Historians still argue whether the primary routes through these high mountain ranges were first systematically explored and charted by hardy local inhabitants, such as high-altitude pastoralists, who then guided outsiders for a price, or if it was long-distance travelers, driven by powerful economic or political incentives, who were the ones to initially discover and brave these perilous defiles, perhaps with reluctant local assistance. It was likely a bit of both, a slow accumulation of shared, hard-won geographical knowledge. One quirky tidbit relating to travel in such extreme environments is the ingenuity often applied to basic survival. For example, while yaks became the quintessential high-altitude pack animal in later periods, earlier travelers would have relied on incredibly hardy breeds of horses or donkeys, and to prevent water skins from freezing solid, they might have kept them close to their bodies or even buried them under sleeping furs at night. There are also folk beliefs about mountain deities residing on specific peaks or in certain passes, requiring offerings or rituals to ensure safe passage. A small sacrifice of food, a prayer, a respectfully placed stone. When faced with such overwhelming natural forces, it's hardly surprising that people sought supernatural aid. You might even find yourself muttering a few pleas to any deity who's listening when you're clinging to a rock face with a 1,000-foot drop below, and the wind is trying its best to peel you off. Please, just let me get to the next vaguely flat bit, and I'll be a better person. I swear it's the original extreme sport, just without the fancy gear, sponsorship deals, or rescue helicopters. Just you, the mountain, and a very real possibility that you won't be coming down the way you intended. All right, so you've just clawed your way over the Pamir Peaks. As we shivered through in Section 6, your lungs still gasping for air that felt far too thin, your fingers and toes only just regaining some semblance of feeling. Or perhaps you're emerging, blinking and sand-scoured from the terrifying embrace of the Taklamakan Desert, a landscape of despair we confronted back in Section 5. Either way, you are exhausted, parched, and probably running dangerously low on anything resembling optimism. Your eyes, raw from wind, sun, and dust, are desperately scanning the seemingly endless, hostile horizon. What you're searching for, with an intensity that borders on prayer, is a smudge of green, a hint of moisture, a sign of life. You're looking for an oasis. These scattered pockets of life are the absolute linchpins of these really long walks. Without them, travel across the vast arid and semi-arid regions of Central Asia would be utterly impossible. They are, quite literally, islands of survival in a sea of desolation, dictating the routes, the pace, and the very feasibility of your journey. Remember those accidental pathways we talked about in Section 4? They weren't so much pathways between places as they were a desperate game of connect the dots, with each dot being one of these life-sustaining havens. The distance from one oasis to the next determined how much water you had to carry, how much food your pack animals, if you still had any needed, and how close to death's door you might be upon arrival. Imagine the scene days, perhaps weeks, of trudging through relentless heat or biting cold, through landscapes that offer nothing but rock, sand, or barren steppe. Your water skin is nearly empty, its contents warm and tasting faintly of animal hide. Your throat is a dry rasp. Hope is a dwindling ember. And then, you see it, or rather, your guide, if you're fortunate, points to a subtle change in the distant haze, a darker line on the horizon, the faintest hint of vegetation. As you draw closer, details emerge: a cluster of date palms, the improbable green of cultivated fields, perhaps even the glint of water. The relief is so profound it's almost a physical blow. Finding an oasis after days of such hardship must have felt like stumbling upon a five-star resort with a complimentary buffet. If your idea of a buffet is anything that isn't more dust, the transition can be shockingly abrupt. One moment you're in the sterile, silent desert. The next, you're assailed by the sounds and smells of life. You hear the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, actual birds, the bleating of goats, the murmur of human voices. You smell damp earth, growing things, the smoke from cooking fires. The air itself feels cooler, heavier with moisture. You stumble towards the water source, a spring, a well, a sluggish river fed by distant mountain snowmelt. And the act of drinking, of splashing cool water on your sun-baked face, feels like a resurrection. This isn't just hydration, it's salvation. These oases are more than just watering holes. They are often small, self-contained worlds, tiny pockets of civilization. Here you find people, oasis dwellers who have mastered the art of coaxing life from the grudging earth. They cultivate crops like dates, figs, apricots, melons, and hardy grains like millet or barley. They raise animals. They build dwellings, perhaps simple huts of mud brick, reeds, or woven branches, clustered together for mutual support. This is where you might, if you're lucky and have something to trade, replenish your supplies, a bit of grain, some dried fruit, fodder for your animals. A mainstream historical fact is the incredible ingenuity of ancient irrigation systems like the Qanat in Persian areas or Kharez in Turkic Central Asia. These were, and in some places still are, gently sloping underground tunnels that tap into alluvial aquifers at the heads of valleys and channel water for many kilometers to settlements and agricultural lands. A testament to sophisticated engineering that allowed oases to flourish even in hyper-arid environments. But what about shelter for you, the weary traveler? Don't envision grand, purpose-built caravanserai with neatly arranged rooms and secure courtyards, not in these earliest days of long, unorganized walks. Rudimentary shelter was more likely to be a patch of ground in a designated or simply tolerated camping area on the outskirts of the oasis settlement. Perhaps there's a rock overhang that offers some protection from the elements. or a grove of trees for shade. If the locals are feeling particularly entrepreneurial, or if your group looks like it might offer interesting goods or news rather than just trouble, there might be a very basic hut or a walled compound where you can rest with a little more security. Sometimes, shelter was simply the relative safety of being near other human beings after days of isolation, a shared space around a communal well. These oases were also places of human interaction. For better or worse, you might encounter other travelers coming from the opposite direction, a chance to exchange precious information about the route ahead. Water conditions, bandit activity, the mood of local chieftains. You might find opportunities for barter, exchanging some small item you've carried for something you desperately need. But oases could also be points of friction. Resources were finite. Too many travelers, or a prolonged drought, could strain an oasis to its breaking point. Local populations, understandably protective of their precious water and cultivated lands, might be wary of outsiders, levying taxes or tolls for access, or simply being unwelcoming. Historians still argue whether the earliest oasis settlements developed primarily as self-sufficient agricultural communities that merely tolerated the intermittent passage of travelers, or if their very existence, their economic specialization, and their demographic growth became intrinsically linked to and dependent upon these nascent, long-distance movements and the small-scale trade they facilitated from a very early stage. There's a quirky fragility to oasis life, too. A shift in a river's course, the silting up of a spring, or the relentless encroachment of desert sands could doom an oasis, turning a once thriving community into another set of sun-bleached ruins. Legends often arose around particular oases, tales of sacred springs with healing properties, or guardian spirits that needed to be appeased. Travelers might leave small offerings, a token of thanks for safe arrival, or a plea for continued good fortune. Maybe there's a uniquely sweet type of melon that only grows in one particular spot, a local delicacy that, for a fleeting moment, makes the hardship of the journey worthwhile. Imagine the ancient equivalent of a food blogger. Just reached the Al-Kharid Oasis. Their dates divine, water, a bit gritty, 5 out of 10 camels, and yet would stop again if dying of thirst. These points of light and life, these hope-giving mirages that turned out to be real, were the absolute foundation upon which any longer, more sustained travel was built. They were the fragile beads on the string that Zhang Xian and his contemporaries, and countless unnamed others before and after, followed across the terrifying vacancies of the ancient world. Each one reached was a victory, a reprieve, a chance to gather strength for the next leg of what was still, fundamentally, a really, really long and dangerous walk. Having barely survived the horrors of desert and mountain, and having perhaps found a moment's respite in one of those precious, life-giving oases we explored in Section 7, maybe you even managed to trade a story for a handful of dried figs. You might be starting to wonder about the actual stuff of these really long walks. We know people were driven by the desperate need for survival, the allure of spiritual stones like jade, or the strategic desire for better horses. As we've discussed, Zhang Qian, our accidental tourist, certainly opened eyes to the West. But what, if anything, was trickling in the other direction? Specifically outwards from the settled lands of, say, early China, in these formative centuries before silk became the headline act. If you're picturing caravans laden with shimmering brocades and delicate porcelain, making their way west at this very early stage, you might need to adjust your mental image quite significantly. Think less luxury boutique and more ancient equivalent of a car boot sale, but much, much dustier. The truth is, the earliest goods moving westwards along these nascent, dangerous pathways were likely far from glamorous. They were probably practical, utilitarian, and perhaps only valuable because they were simply unavailable, or harder to come by, in the regions they eventually reached. We're talking about items that reflect basic needs and early technological developments, rather than sophisticated artistry or high fashion. Imagine yourself as an inhabitant of a small oasis town in the Tarim Basin, or a member of a nomadic group in the steppes. What might someone stumbling out of the East, having survived weeks or months on the trail, actually have that you'd find useful enough to trade for? Consider simple pottery. Not the fine, translucent porcelain that would later captivate the world, but sturdy, everyday earthenware pots, bowls, and storage jars. If a particular village or region in the East had developed slightly more efficient or durable pottery techniques, their wares might have been desirable further afield. These wouldn't be prized for their beauty, but for their utility, a pot that doesn't leak, a jar that keeps rodents out of your precious grain. It's not going to make anyone a millionaire, but it meets a need. You can almost hear the sales pitch, behold, this is a container. It contains things remarkably well for a baked clay receptacle. What am I bid? Then there are basic metal goods. As bronze and later ironworking technologies developed in China, simple tools, implements, or perhaps even small weapons might have made their way west. An axe head that holds its edge a bit longer, a knife that's less prone to snapping, arrowheads with a superior design, these could offer a tangible advantage in daily life or conflict. Again, we're not talking about ornate ceremonial swords. Think more along the lines of a slightly better farming hoe or a more reliable spear point. The mainstream historical fact here is that archaeologists have indeed found examples of early Chinese bronze items, and later iron, in sites across Central Asia, sometimes thousands of kilometers from their origin, dating to periods well before the formal Silk Road is usually considered to have begun. This material evidence, though sometimes sparse, confirms that some goods were on the move. What about textiles? Silk, in its fully developed, luxurious form, was still largely a closely guarded secret and an imperial monopoly. Its widespread export a thing of the future, but simpler. Coarser textiles might have been part of the mix. Things made from hemp, or perhaps wool from regions that specialized in it. These wouldn't have been status symbols, but practical materials for clothing or shelter. Animal hides, too, if properly cured, could have been a valuable commodity, especially if they came from animals not commonly found in a particular area, or if the curing technique was superior. It's important to remember the nature of this early trade. It wasn't organized commerce with merchant guilds and letters of credit. Much of it was likely down-the-line exchange. An item might be bartered in one oasis, then carried by its new owner to the next, where it might be traded again, and so on. With each transaction, its origin might become more obscure, and its perceived value could change based on local needs and availability. A simple iron pot, common in its place of manufacture, might become a prized possession several hundred miles west, where metalworking was less advanced or ore sources were scarce. Historians still argue whether this very earliest westward flow of Chinese goods was driven more by accidental diffusion, items carried by migrating peoples, or trickling out through intermittent contact with nomadic groups who had their own extensive ancient networks of movement, or if there were already some proto-traders. Individuals with a bit of foresight and a lot of courage, intentionally seeking out niche markets for even these humble commodities. It's likely a combination of both. Some items might have spread organically, almost randomly, while others might have been part of a more purposeful, if still very small scale and risky, enterprise. One quirky tidbit to consider is how the perceived value or use of an object could change dramatically as it moved from one culture to another. Imagine a simple agricultural implement from a settled farming community in China being traded to a nomadic group. They might have no use for it in its intended function, but perhaps its shape is intriguing, or its metal can be repurposed into something else, a weapon, an ornament, a tool for working leather. A humble object could take on a whole new life and new meanings, far from home. This is the ancient equivalent of someone buying an old piece of farm equipment at an antique store and turning it into rustic chic home decor, only with slightly more existential stakes. Is it a ritual object, a weapon, a very uncomfortable hat? So, as you are weary traveler, sit in that oasis. You might observe these small exchanges. Someone trades a few well-made bronze arrowheads for a skin of fermented mare's milk. Someone else offers a sturdy earthenware jar in return for directions to the next water source. It's not the stuff of legends. Not yet. These are the quiet, almost invisible beginnings of a network that would one day move mountains of silk, gold, and spices. But for now, it's about the practical, the durable, the things that might just make life a tiny bit easier or a tiny bit more secure in a world that is still overwhelmingly harsh and unpredictable. These unimpressive items are the unsung pioneers of the Silk Road, the humble vanguard paving the way for the riches to come. One pot, one tool, one really long walk at a time. So, you've seen the kinds of rather unimpressive utilitarian goods that might have been trickling westwards out of early China. Those sturdy pots and basic tools we pondered in Section 8 items valued more for their practicality than their sparkle. But trade, even in its most nascent, accidental forms, is rarely a one-way street for long. While the inhabitants of those distant oases or nomadic camps might have found some use for a well-made Chinese earthenware jar, the imperial court and the elites back in the Han heartlands had their own shopping list. And let me tell you, their desires often had a slightly more urgent and decidedly more imperial flavor. Chief among these desires, the item that could make emperors dispatch armies and envoys risk life and limb, often involuntarily. In the case of poor Zhang Qian's initial outing, was the horse. But not just any horse. We've touched on this before, back in Section 2 when we spoke of early horse needs, and again with Zhang Qian's wide-eyed reports from Fergana in Section 3. The Han dynasty, particularly under Emperor Wu, had an almost obsessive craving for the superior horse breeds of Central Asia, especially those from Daiwan in the Fergana Valley, the famed heavenly horses or blood-sweating horses. You have to understand, for a settled agricultural empire like Han China, constantly dealing with the highly mobile, cavalry-based threat of nomadic peoples like the Xiongnu, good horses weren't just a status symbol. They were a matter of national security. Their native ponies were often smaller, less hardy, and no match for the steeds that thundered across the steppes under Xiongnu riders. Imagine trying to win a Formula One race with a sensible family sedan. That was the kind of equine disparity the Han were facing. So, when Zhang Qian came back with tales and presumably some very detailed descriptions of these magnificent Central Asian chargers, larger, faster, stronger, capable of incredible endurance, it was like waving a catalog of high-performance military hardware in front of a very motivated buyer. The desire for these horses became a driving force behind many of the westward expeditions that followed. This wasn't just about a casual upgrade, it was about fundamentally changing the balance of power. A truly significant mainstream historical fact is that Emperor Wu of Han was so determined to obtain these Fergana horses that he launched 2 full-scale military campaigns against Daiwan, around 104 to 102 BCE, when diplomatic efforts and trade failed to yield the thousands of breeding animals he desired. That's right, they literally went to war for horses. It puts your desire for the latest smartphone into perspective, doesn't it? Bringing these animals back was an epic undertaking in itself. First, you had to acquire them, either through trade offering what gold, or perhaps the promise of future highly desirable goods like silk, though we're still a bit early for mass silk exports or as tribute, or, as we've seen, through military conquest. Then, you had to shepherd these valuable and probably rather temperamental beasts back across the same terrifying deserts and treacherous mountain ranges we've already endured. The Taklamakan, the Pamirs. Trying to get 1,000 highly strung war horses, already legendary for their spirit, to politely walk across a glacier or patiently wait out a sandstorm requires a level of animal husbandry and sheer grit that's hard to fathom. It makes modern international pet shipping look like a gentle stroll to the dog park. Beyond the all-consuming passion for horses, what other rarities were making their way east into China along these early perilous paths? Jade, and of course, remained a perennial favorite. As we discussed way back in Section 2, Nephrite jade from Khotan and other sites in the Kunlun Mountains had been prized in China for millennia for its ritual significance and beauty. This trade, if you can call the arduous procurement of heavy stones a trade, continued. A constant westward pull for this sacred material. Other items were likely much more sporadic and perhaps accidental in their arrival. Glassware, for instance, particularly from Roman or Near Eastern workshops, was virtually unknown in early China, where glazed ceramics were the norm. Small glass beads, bowls, or fragments, trickling in through many intermediate hands, would have been seen as exotic marvels, almost magical in their transparency and vibrant colors. These weren't bulk imports, but precious curiosities, hinting at distant but sophisticated cultures. Certain plants, too, made the eastward journey, often as unintended but welcome consequences of expeditions. Zhang Qian is famously credited with bringing back alfalfa lucerne to feed those prized horses, and grapevines, which would eventually lead to winemaking in China. These weren't trade goods in the commercial sense initially, but their long-term agricultural and cultural impact was immense. Imagine the imperial botanist. So, you didn't get the alliance. You were a prisoner for a decade, but these grapes, they show promise. Furs from animals native to the colder northern steppes or Siberian forest might also have found their way south and east, prized for their warmth and luxuriousness. Exotic animal products, perhaps strange feathers, or even live animals if anyone was brave or foolish enough to transport them, could have appeared as diplomatic gifts or rare trophies. Historians still argue whether the Han court's desire for these Western rarities was driven primarily by pragmatic needs, like the military necessity for horses, or if it was equally, if not more so, fueled by a desire for prestige, a way for the emperor to display his power and the vast reach of his influence by possessing exotic goods and creatures from the furthest known corners of the earth. One quirky tidbit that surrounds the legendary blood-sweating horses of Fergana is the mystery of the blood itself. Some scholars suggest it might have been caused by a parasitic nematode, Parafilaria multipapillosa, which lives under the skin and can cause minor subcutaneous bleeding, especially after exertion. Others think it was simply the animal's sweat mixing with fine dust to create a reddish tinge, or the visual effect of sunlight on exceptionally glossy coats after hard riding. Whatever the cause, the evocative name certainly added to their mystique and desirability, making them sound like creatures of myth, truly heavenly. It's the kind of branding that marketing executives dream of, even if it's based on a skin parasite. So, as you picture those early pathways, remember it wasn't just a slow outward diffusion of humble Chinese good. There was a powerful, often imperially driven, suction-pulling specific, high-value items eastward, the desire for these incredible horses, for that luminous jade, for any hint of the exotic and unknown, was a powerful engine driving these really long walks, transforming faint trails into arteries of an embryonic global network. The risks were enormous, the journey brutal, but the rewards for those who sought them and survived could be the stuff of legend, or at least a very, very fast horse. So, you've somehow managed to acquire your precious cargo. Perhaps you're heading east with a string of those highly sought-after Central Asian horses we discussed in Section 9, their breath misting in the cold mountain air. Or maybe you're one of the hardy souls heading west, your pack animals laden with some of those surprisingly useful, if unglamorous, Chinese goods like basic pottery or metal tools we covered in Section 8. You've navigated the terrifying emptiness of the Taklamakan, skirted its life-giving oases, and perhaps even dragged yourself over the frozen passes of the Pamirs or Tian Shan. You're starting to feel like you've got a handle on this really long walk business. You can read the terrain, you know where the water sources are mostly, and you've even learned how to bargain for a handful of dates without giving away your spare pair of sandals. But just when you think you've mastered the geographical challenges, you encounter the human element in its most dynamic, unpredictable, and often downright dangerous form, the nomadic tribes of the vast Eurasian steppes. These aren't the settled folk of the oases, tending their small plots of land, nor are they the organized citizens of the distant Han Empire. These are people of the grasslands, masters of the horse and bow, their lives dictated by the seasonal needs of their herds of horses, sheep, goats, and camels. Their world is one of constant movement, a sprawling, ever-shifting domain that often lies squarely across the very pathways you're trying to traverse. And the most prominent, most powerful, and often most problematic of these groups, especially for anyone venturing out from Han China, is the Xiongnu Confederation. You might remember them as the folks who gave Jiang Qian that extended, involuntary 10-year cultural exchange program. They weren't just a minor nuisance, they were a major regional power. Imagine you're leading your small caravan through a wide, grassy valley. The silence of the steppes, usually broken only by the wind or the cry of a hawk, is suddenly punctuated by a distant drumming of hooves. A knot of tension tightens in your stomach. Within minutes, they appear a band of riders, materializing as if from the earth itself. Their figures lean and weathered, their movements fluid and confident on horseback. These are Xiongnu warriors, or perhaps from one of the many other tribes like the Wusun or the Kangju, whose territories you might be infringing upon. Their presence immediately changes everything. Are they merely curious? Do they see you as a potential trading opportunity? Or do they view you as a convenient, mobile source of tribute, or, to put it less delicately, plunder? The tolls you might pay on these routes are rarely clearly advertised with a neat little sign saying, "Last chance for extortion-free passage for 50 miles." It's far more unpredictable. A local chieftain, feeling his power, might demand a gift, perhaps one of your best animals, a roll of that coarse textile you're carrying, or a share of your food supplies in exchange for safe passage through his lands. Refusal could mean anything from a simple beating to the confiscation of all your goods, or worse. Sometimes it's not even an organized demand. A roving band of young warriors, out to prove their mettle or simply bored, might decide that your caravan looks like an easy target. Suddenly, arrows are whistling past your ears, and you're in a desperate fight for your life and possessions. You know it's a tough neighborhood when the welcome committee is a group of mounted archers looking distinctly unimpressed with your travel documents and far more interested in the contents of your saddlebags. A significant mainstream historical fact about the Xiongnu is that they weren't just scattered bands of raiders. By the Han Dynasty period, they had formed a sophisticated and powerful tribal confederation, led by a supreme ruler known as the Chanyu or Shanyu. This confederation was capable of fielding massive armies, conducting large-scale raids deep into Han territory, and negotiating complex political and trade relationships with the Chinese Empire. They were a formidable rival state, and their influence stretched across a vast swathe of Central Asia. This meant that encounters weren't always just random skirmishes. They could be interactions with representatives of a significant political power, with its own rules and protocols, however opaque they might seem to an outsider. However, it wasn't all unrelenting hostility. Nomadic groups, with their intimate knowledge of the steppes, the deserts, and the mountain passes, could also be invaluable, if often expensive. Guides, they knew where the hidden springs were, which routes were safest from other, more hostile tribes, and how to navigate in landscapes that would seem utterly featureless to you. Sometimes, the toll you paid might actually be for genuine services rendered. Furthermore, these nomadic peoples were traders themselves, with their own networks of exchange. They valued goods like grain, metal tools and weapons, and, eventually, Chinese silks. Your passage might be tolerated or even welcomed if you had something they genuinely desired and were willing to trade fairly. Though their definition of fair might differ somewhat from yours, historians still argue whether the Han Dynasty's extensive and often costly tributary system, with groups like the Xiongnu, which involved sending vast quantities of silk, grain, and other goods as gifts, was primarily a sophisticated diplomatic tool to manage relations and subtly encourage Chinese cultural influence. Or, if it was often, in practical terms, a thinly veiled form of protection money paid to nomadic powers to prevent raids and maintain a semblance of peace on the frontiers. One particularly quirky and intimidating tidbit about Xiongnu military tactics was their use of singing arrows. These were arrows fletched with specially designed holes or carved bone whistle points that created an eerie, high-pitched whistling sound as they flew through the air. A volley of these, fired by a massed cavalry charge, would not only be physically dangerous but also psychologically terrifying, a screaming harbinger of the attack. Imagine the chilling sound of hundreds of these bearing down on you in the otherwise quiet steppe. It's the kind of thing that would make you seriously reconsider your career choices as a long-distance walker. The human landscape of these early routes was a complex mosaic of different tribes, each with its own language, customs, and shifting allegiances. The Yuezhi, before they were pushed west by the Yongnu, were a major power. The Wusun in the Ili Valley, the Kangju in Sogdia, interacting with each required a different approach, a different understanding of local politics. What might be acceptable to one group could be a deadly insult to another. This constant need to navigate not just the physical terrain but also the treacherous currents of intertribal relations added yet another layer of profound difficulty and danger to these already really long walks. Your survival often depended as much on your diplomatic skills or your ability to look completely unthreatening and impoverished as it did on your endurance. So, you've had your thrilling and likely terrifying encounters with the various nomadic tribes of the steppes as we navigated in Section 10. You've learned that a friendly wave might not always be met with an equally friendly response, and that the concept of a toll can be remarkably flexible and often involves parting with something you'd really rather keep, like your lunch or your least smelly pair of socks. As you continue these really long walks, however, you begin to notice a subtle but growing shift in the human landscape, particularly along the routes leading west from the Chinese heartlands. It's a more organized presence, a less chaotic and more persistent influence making itself felt the slow, creeping expansion of the Han dynasty's power. This isn't like a sudden invasion, with legions marching in lockstep to conquer everything in sight. It's more like a gradual tide, ebbing and flowing, but generally pushing westward. Remember Zhang Qian's initial mission. While it was a diplomatic failure in its primary objective of finding allies against the Xiongnu, his reports back to Emperor Wu had planted a seed. The Han court, already deeply concerned about the Xiongnu threat, those formidable horsemen who had been such a thorn in their side, began to see the strategic value of the western regions, not just as a source of those amazing Fergana horses we talked about in Section 9, but as a potential theater for outflanking their nomadic rivals and securing their frontiers. You start to see the signs. Along the vital Hexi corridor, that narrow strip of fertile land squeezed between the Tibetan Plateau and the Gobi Desert, which serves as a natural gateway to the west. Han influence becomes more pronounced. Small and fortified garrisons appear. Rough-hewn watchtowers sprout from the dusty plains, manned by Han soldiers who look distinctly different from the local tribes or the traders passing through. These aren't luxurious postings. They are remote, often dangerous outposts at the very edge of the empire. Their job is to keep the peace Han style. Anyway, protect or control the burgeoning trade routes, and provide early warnings of any Xiongnu incursions. You can imagine the average Han soldier stationed there. Another day, another cartload of dust. Sure beats farming back home. Maybe. One of the key methods the Han used for this slow creep was the Tuntian system. This was an ingenious, if arduous, way of making these remote garrisons somewhat self-sufficient. Soldiers were also farmers. They'd be sent to these frontier regions, often with their families, to cultivate the land, dig irrigation channels, a vital skill learned from those oasis dwellers, perhaps, and grow crops to feed themselves and the army. This gradually transformed patches of the landscape, creating small pockets of Han agricultural settlement in areas previously dominated by pastoral nomads or sparse oasis farming. It was a slow but effective way of planting the imperial flag, one dusty field at a time. This expansion wasn't just about soldiers and farmers. Han officials, envoys, and administrators started to appear in the oasis states of the Tarim Basin, places like Lulan, Kucha, or Khotan. Sometimes they were there to offer protection which often came with strings attached, sometimes to forge alliances, sometimes to mediate disputes between local rulers, and always to further Han interests. A major mainstream historical fact is the establishment of the Protectorate of the Western regions by the Han Dynasty around 60 BCE. This office, though its actual power and reach waxed and waned considerably over the centuries, represented a formal Han claim to suzerainty over many of these oasis kingdoms, an attempt to bring them into the Han sphere of influence and coordinate efforts against the Xiongnu. For you, the weary traveler, this Han creep could be a mixed blessing. On the one hand, the presence of Han garrisons might offer a degree of increased safety along certain stretches of the route. There's a slightly better chance that a well-armed Han patrol might deter casual banditry, or that a dispute at an oasis might be settled by a Han official rather than by a free-for-all brawl. You might find more reliable, though still very basic supply points, or at least a place where your Chinese currency or goods are more readily understood. On the other hand, Han control meant Han rules. It meant taxes, regulations, and the distinct possibility of getting caught up in the complex and often brutal politics between the Han, the Xiongnu, and the various oasis states who were frequently caught in the middle, trying to play one superpower off against the other to maintain their own precarious independence. Your journey might be rerouted, or you might find yourself waiting for days, even weeks, for permission from a local Han commander to proceed. The Xiongnu probably viewed this Han expansion much like you'd view a neighbor who keeps subtly moving their garden fence a few inches onto your prize-winning petunia patch each year, with growing irritation and the occasional accidental trampling. Historians still argue whether this westward expansion by the Han dynasty was a deliberate, strategically planned imperial policy driven by a grand vision from the outset, or if it was a more reactive, piecemeal process, a series of ad hoc responses to immediate border threats, unforeseen opportunities, and the reports of ambitious generals or envoys on the frontier. It was likely a bit of both, a general imperial ambition coupled with pragmatic, on-the-ground decision-making. A fascinating and quirky insight into the daily reality of this Han expansion comes from the discovery of thousands of inscribed wooden slips and bamboo strips at the sites of Han-era garrisons and watchtowers in the desert, particularly around Dunhuang and along the Edsengol River. These aren't grand imperial pronouncements. They are the mundane paperwork of empire supply requisitions. Need more arrows, less sand in the grain. Duty rosters, letters home from soldiers, reports on nomadic movements, even personal shopping lists. They offer an incredibly intimate, unvarnished glimpse into the everyday lives, struggles, and concerns of the individuals who are the nuts and bolts of this slow creep westward. It's history written not on stone monuments, but on the ancient equivalent of inner office memos and sticky notes. So, as you trudge along, you're witnessing the very gradual transformation of these really long walks. They are slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming arteries of an empire, conduits not just for those humble goods or precious horses, but for political power, military strategy, and cultural influence. The wild, untamed pathways are beginning to feel the faintest touch of imperial order, a process that would continue for centuries, shaping the destiny of entire regions. So, you've witnessed the slow, almost imperceptible westward creep of Han Dynasty influence we discussed in Section 11 with its garrisons, soldier farmers, and budding bureaucracy. You might be lulled into a false sense of security, thinking that these really long walks are gradually becoming safer, more predictable. Perhaps you imagine a Han border guard on every corner, cheerfully offering directions and a cup of slightly gritty tea. Well, it's time for a reality check, because even with those new outposts trying to project some semblance of order, or the occasional uneasy truce you might have brokered with a nomadic chieftain, like we imagined in Section 10, the vast, sprawling stretches of wilderness between these pinpricks of tenuous civilization were still a terrifying free-for-all. The omnipresent dangers of bandits, beasts, and the simple, soul-crushing possibility of vanishing without a trace remained very much a part of your daily travel experience. Let's talk bandits. These aren't necessarily the large, politically motivated Xiongnu warbands we've already met. Think smaller, more desperate groups outcast from their own tribes, deserters from Han garrisons, impoverished locals driven to extremes, or just opportunistic thugs who saw a poorly defended traveler as a walking treasure chest. They'd lurk in narrow mountain passes, those same terrifying ledges we navigated in Section 6 waiting to ambush you. They'd hide among the dunes on the outskirts of an oasis, knowing you'd be tired and less vigilant after days in the desert we endured in Section 5. A sudden rush of figures, a glint of crude weaponry, and your carefully hoarded supplies, your trade goods, even your life could be forfeit. There's no emergency number to call, no sheriff to whistle for. You're on your own, and your best hope is either to look too poor to be worth robbing, too tough to be an easy target, or just be very, very lucky. If someone asked your family if you had travel insurance before you left, the answer would have been a blank stare, followed by, "What's insurance? We just hope he doesn't get eaten." And then there are the beasts, the Central Asian landmass, for all its arid stretches, teemed with wildlife, and not all of it was inclined to give you a wide berth. Wolves were a significant concern, especially in the steppes and forested mountain valleys. Traveling alone or in a small, weak group at dusk or dawn could make you a very appealing target for a hungry pack. Bears, too, inhabited some of the more remote mountain and wooded regions. And while perhaps less of a direct predatory threat on the main arid routes, you couldn't entirely discount the possibility of encountering large cats like snow leopards in the high mountains, their camouflage making them virtually invisible until it was far too late. Even smaller creatures posed a threat: venomous snakes basking on sun-warmed rocks, scorpions scuttling into your bedding for warmth, spiders with bites that could lay you low for days, far from any hope of medical attention. The local wildlife wasn't running a quaint bed and breakfast, it was more of an eat or be eaten kind of scenario. And you were definitely on the menu if you weren't careful. But perhaps the most insidious, most constant fear wasn't just the threat of a violent end from human or animal predators. It was the terrifying ease with which you could simply disappear, vanish, cease to exist, with no one knowing how or where. Imagine being caught in a blizzard in those high mountain passes, the snow swirling so thickly you can't see your own hand in front of your face, the path obliterated, every landmark gone, or a sandstorm in the Taklamakan, a howling vortex of grit and fury that disorients you completely, separates you from your companions or your animals, and buries any track you might have been following. You wander for days, your water gone, your hope shriveling, until you become just another set of bleached bones for future travelers to stumble upon. A grim, silent warning. You could take a wrong turn in a seemingly featureless expanse of steppe, veer just a few degrees off course, and miss the next vital oasis by miles, condemning yourself to a slow death from thirst. You could slip on a loose rock and fall into a ravine. You could attempt a river crossing, misjudge the current, and be swept away. Illness or a simple infected wound. Things we treat with a quick trip to the pharmacy. Could be a death sentence out here, hundreds of miles from any semblance of care. The historical record, even from later, more documented periods of Silk Road travel, is replete with accounts of such dangers. Monks like Faxian and Xuanzang, centuries after the period we're currently in, wrote vividly of the perils of the journey. The lost caravans, the terrifying landscapes. The dangers were timeless. This constant, gnawing awareness of your own fragility, of how easily your small spark of life could be snuffed out, must have had a profound psychological impact. The loneliness, the isolation, the sheer oppressive scale of the wilderness around you, it could wear down even the most resilient spirit. Every dawn was a small victory. Every sunset a reminder of the perils the night might hold. Historians still argue whether the greatest consistent threat to these early travelers was the direct, acute danger of organized human violence, such as large-scale nomadic raids or persistent banditry, or if it was the more chronic, attritional wear and tear of the sheer unforgiving nature of the environment itself. starvation, dehydration, exposure, accidents, and disease. It was probably an unwelcome cocktail of all of the above. As a quirky, though grim, tidbit, one can only imagine the kinds of desperate last messages people might have tried to leave if they knew their end was near. A name scratched onto a rock, a small, personal token buried in a specific spot with the faint hope it might one day be found. Or perhaps the superstitions and rituals travelers developed to try and ward off these dangers an amulet clutched for protection. A prayer muttered to a local spirit before attempting a dangerous pass. A careful avoidance of places rumored to be unlucky or haunted. When faced with such overwhelming and unpredictable perils, any small sense of agency, however illusory, would have been a comfort. So, while the Han might be slowly extending their administrative reach, and while you might occasionally find a guide or a somewhat safer route, never forget that for the most part, you are a tiny, vulnerable speck in an immense and indifferent wilderness. The really long walk isn't just about distance. It's about navigating a constant, shifting landscape of potentially lethal threats. Survival is not guaranteed. It's a daily, hard-won achievement. And for every traveler who made it, how many simply vanished? Their stories untold, their fates unknown, becoming just another whisper in the wind across the vast, silent lands. All right, so you've somehow, against considerable odds, managed to navigate the gauntlet of perils we just walked through in Section 12. You haven't become a bandit's payday, a wolf's dinner, or another anonymous skeleton bleaching under the relentless desert sun. You've learned that even with the slow encroachment of Han Imperial power providing occasional pockets of relative calm, as discussed in Section 11, these really long walks are still fraught with danger. But as you interact, however briefly or cautiously, with the diverse tapestry of humanity along these routes, the Han soldiers in their dusty garrisons, the stoic oasis dwellers tending their precious green patches. Section 7. Even those formidable nomadic horsemen. Section 10, something else, almost invisible, begins to hitch a ride. It's far more subtle than a bale of coarse cloth or a string of hard-won Fergana horses. It's the first faint, almost accidental stirring of an exchange of ideas. Don't get too excited. We're not talking about international philosophical symposia or missionaries eloquently translating sacred texts just yet. That's for a much later, more established Silk Road. Right now, the transfer of ideas is as nascent, as haphazard, and often as unintentional as the movement of those meager goods we talked about in Section 8. It's happening in the tiny interactions, the shared moments around a sputtering campfire, the observation of a different way of doing something. Imagine you're a Han soldier, part of that Tuntian agricultural colony. You see the local oasis dwellers using a particular technique to lift water from their wells, or a specific way of pruning their fruit trees. It's different from how you did it back in your home province. Maybe you try it. Maybe it works better. An idea, a very practical agricultural idea, has been transferred, not through a scholarly treatise, but through simple observation and imitation. Or perhaps you're a trader, and you notice that the pottery from a particular oasis village has a distinctive glaze or a unique decorative motif you haven't seen before. You might not understand its symbolism, but you might find it appealing, and perhaps you try to describe it or even sketch it when you get back home, influencing a local artisan there. Language itself, in its most rudimentary form, becomes a conduit. You pick up a few words of the local dialect at an oasis, enough to barter for water, to ask for directions, to convey basic greetings or warnings. In learning those words, you're also absorbing tiny fragments of a different conceptual world. A word for a particular type of spirit said to inhabit a mountain pass. A term for a kinship relationship that doesn't quite exist in your own culture. These are linguistic seeds that can carry surprisingly complex cultural information. A shared song, even if you don't understand all the words, can convey emotion, rhythm, a different way of seeing the world. The first international cultural exchange probably wasn't a meticulously planned event. It was likely someone humming a catchy tune they heard at a desert well, and someone else picking it up. Consider the objects themselves: a new type of clasp for a cloak, a differently shaped tool, a child's toy carved in an unfamiliar style. These items, as they move from hand to hand, carry with them the imprint of their makers' minds, their aesthetic preferences, their technological solutions to common problems. Someone in a distant land might unwrap a traded item and not just see an object, but a new way of making, a new way of decorating. A mainstream historical fact is that the diffusion of technologies like chariot design and construction, and much later, ironworking techniques, across vast swaths of Eurasia happened over centuries, long before the Silk Road proper. This demonstrates that complex practical knowledge, a very potent kind of idea, could indeed travel, often through many intermediary cultures and countless small interactions. Religious or spiritual notions, too, could begin their slow, almost invisible journey, not as complete theological systems, but as fragments and amulet seen to be effective against a particular ailment, a gesture of respect towards a local shrine, a story about a powerful mountain god or a benevolent water spirit. These wouldn't necessarily convert anyone to a new religion, but they might add to the existing tapestry of folk beliefs, creating syncretic localized practices. You see a fellow traveler tie a strip of cloth to a tree at a high pass, muttering a prayer for safety. You don't know their gods, but the sentiment is universal. Maybe next time you do something similar. Historians still argue whether these earliest discernible transfers of ideas across Eurasia they were primarily facilitated by the larger-scale movements of migrating peoples who would carry their entire cultural toolkit with them to new lands, or if individual long-distance travelers and traders, however few and far between they were in these early days, played a more significant role as the initial catalyst for cultural diffusion, introducing novel concepts one by one. It's likely a complex interplay. One quirky aspect of this early, accidental idea exchange is the high potential for misunderstanding, for a concept to be entirely transformed as it passes through different cultural filters. Imagine trying to explain a complex social custom or a philosophical idea using only a handful of shared nouns and a lot of vigorous gesturing. The game of telephone effect would be immense. A story about a wise old sage could, after a few hundred miles and several linguistic leaps, turn into a tale about a grumpy mountain troll who gives surprisingly good financial advice. Or a practical farming technique, misunderstood, could become a bizarre and utterly ineffective ritual. It's how cultural mutations happen, one garbled message at a time. So, you're saying if I wear this pot on my head, it will make my goats more fertile. Interesting. Worth a try, I suppose. So, as you are an intrepid walker of really long distances, continue your journey. Remember that you're not just a pair of weary feet on a dusty track. You are an observer, a listener, a potential, if unwitting, carrier of ideas. Every person you meet, every different custom you witness, every new word you learn is a tiny spark. Most will flicker out, forgotten. But a few might ignite something somewhere down the line in a way you could never predict. This is the very, very beginning of the Silk Road, not just as a conduit for goods, but as a network for the human mind. A fragile web of connections that would eventually, and profoundly, shape the world. So, you've witnessed these first, faint stirrings of intellectual exchange. Those almost accidental transfers of ideas and customs that we explored in Section 13 happening alongside the movement of rather meager goods. It's tempting, isn't it, to start thinking of these paths as the Silk Road in miniature, a precursor to the grand highway of commerce and culture we often imagine. But hold that thought, because now it's time for a crucial reality check. For the period we're deeply immersed in, these really long walks, these incredibly arduous treks across deserts and mountains, were overwhelmingly not about luxurious silks shimmering their way to distant empires. That iconic image, while true for later centuries, simply doesn't fit the gritty, desperate reality of these initial overland journeys. This was, for want of a better term, the no-silk road, or perhaps the mostly just sweat and fear road. The very name, Silk Road, or Seidenstrasse in German, was coined in the 19th century by a geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen. It's a wonderfully evocative term, but it casts a very specific, silk-tinted lens over a network that was, for a vast period of its early existence, driven by far more fundamental and less glamorous concerns. If you had stopped one of our weary travelers, say around the 2nd century BCE, as they were hauling unworked jade out of Khotan as we pictured in Section 2, or desperately trying to acquire some decent horses from Fergana, a major theme from Sections 2, 3, and 9, and told them they were on the Silk Road, they'd probably just stare at you blankly, perhaps wondering if silk was a new type of particularly nasty desert insect they hadn't yet had the misfortune to encounter. Silk, is that edible? Does it keep the wolves away? The primary drivers for these monumental efforts were, as we've seen, far more visceral. First and foremost, it was about survival. That raw, basic human need to find food, water, and a slightly less hostile environment that propelled those earliest unrecorded drifts we imagined in Section 1. It was about responding to scarcity and environmental pressures. Then came the quest for specific, highly valued resources that weren't necessarily about daily subsistence, but offered other crucial advantages: nephrite jade for its spiritual and social significance in early China, and those powerful Central Asian horses, essential for warfare and imperial prestige. The Han Dynasty's gradual westward expansion, that slow creep we felt in Section 11, wasn't primarily motivated by a desire to open up new markets for luxury exports. It was about national security, countering the Xiongnu threat, securing the frontiers, and projecting imperial power. Any trade that developed was often a secondary consequence, or a tool of diplomacy, rather than the prime objective. The goods that did trickle westwards from China in these early days, as we discussed in Section 8, were generally utilitarian simple pottery, basic metal tools, perhaps some coarse textiles. These were items of practical value, not symbols of opulent wealth. The scale of exchange was also vastly different from the later Silk Road era. We're not talking about large, organized merchant caravans led by seasoned professionals specializing in long-distance luxury trade. That class of entrepreneur was still in its infancy. If it existed at all in this context, much of the exchange was small-scale, intermittent, happening down the line from one oasis to the next, from one tribal group to another. Remember those accidental pathways? Section 4. They were not paved with gold or silk. They were etched by desperation, by necessity, by the endless search for a slightly less difficult passage through an unforgiving land. The idea of getting rich quick by hauling exotic treasures was, for most people treading these paths, an absurd fantasy. They were far more concerned with simply making it to the next water source, or surviving the next mountain pass. Sections 5, 6, and 12. A key historical fact to remember is that while silk production was indeed an ancient Chinese technology, mastered centuries before the Han Dynasty, its use was initially largely confined to the Chinese elite and for diplomatic purposes. For instance, the Han often sent large quantities of silk as gifts, or tribute to powerful Xiongnu leaders to pacify them, or to try and sow discord among them. This silk was certainly valuable, but it wasn't yet a freely traded commodity driving a transcontinental commercial boom. That shift, where silk became a major export actively sought by Western markets like Rome, began to accelerate more towards the 1st century BCE and into the Common Era. Historians still argue precisely when this transition occurred, when the westward flow of Chinese silk changed from being primarily a tool of diplomacy and elite internal circulation to a significant demand-driven export commodity that truly began to define the economic character of these transcontinental routes. One quirky tidbit that highlights the sometimes bizarre nature of early cross-cultural encounters with unfamiliar goods comes from much later Roman writers like Pliny the Elder, who had some rather confused ideas about how silk was produced, famously suggesting it was combed from trees. While this is from a later period when silk was a known luxury, it illustrates how exotic materials could be misunderstood. In our earlier no-silk period, if a tiny fragment of silk, perhaps from a diplomatic gift that went astray, reached some remote Western community, they might have had no idea of its true origin or value, perhaps thinking it was a strange type of plant fiber or animal fleece. The real treasures for many on these routes might have been something we'd now consider mundane, a particularly effective type of salt for preserving food, a very sharp and durable bronze knife, or access to a reliable spring in an otherwise waterless waste. So, as you continue this journey in your mind, try to strip away the later romanticism of the Silk Road. These initial arduous treks were raw, unfiltered human endeavors, born of necessity, fear, and the occasional flicker of ambition or curiosity. The profit was often just survival. The luxury was finding shade after a day under a brutal sun. The network was a fragile, often broken thread of human footsteps across some of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. This was the world before silk truly began to weave its magic across continents. A world where the loudest sound on the road was not the rustle of precious fabrics, but the weary sigh of a traveler wondering if they'd live to see another dawn. And so, we've journeyed together through the stark realities of what you might call the no-silk road, as we established in Section 14, an era where shimmering silks were not yet the currency of transcontinental desire, but survival itself was the most precious commodity. You felt the grit of the desert in your teeth. Section 5. The biting cold of the high mountain passes in your bones. Section 6. And the constant, gnawing anxiety of unknown dangers, be they from opportunistic bandits or the unforgiving wilderness itself. Section 12. You've seen how these initial arduous treks were driven by fundamental human needs, the quest for basic resources. Section 1. The allure of specific valuable materials like jade or superior horses. Sections 2 and 9. The strategic imperatives of burgeoning empires like the Han, seeking to secure their frontiers. Section 11. And the quiet, almost accidental exchange of meager goods. Section 8 and even fainter ideas. Section 13. It all sounds rather bleak, doesn't it? A relentless slog with very little immediate payoff for the individual souls braving these paths. You'd be forgiven for wondering what the point of all that suffering was. Yet, it is precisely in these grueling, unglamorous, and often terrifyingly long walks that the very foundations of the famed Silk Road were unknowingly, painstakingly laid. Each desperate journey, each successful navigation of a previously unknown pass. Each encounter with a different culture, and however fraught or fleeting, contributed a tiny, almost invisible thread to what would eventually become a vast and intricate network connecting worlds. Those early travelers, motivated by their immediate and pressing concerns, were not thinking about forging global trade routes or fostering intercontinental cultural exchange. They were thinking about their next meal, the next water source, or fulfilling the orders of a distant emperor like Zhang Qian did on his epic, if initially unintended. Adventure Section 3. Their main legacy at the time was probably just proving it was possible to walk that far without spontaneously combusting from a combination of sheer terror and profound boredom. But consider what their accumulated efforts achieved. Those accidental pathways we discussed in Section 4, worn into the earth by countless repetitions of human and animal feet, gradually became more defined. The knowledge of which mountain passes were seasonally viable, which oases Section 7 could be relied upon, and which nomadic tribes Section 10 were best avoided or appeased, this hard-won intelligence passed along through whispered conversations, crude maps drawn in the dust, or the simple act of following a slightly more experienced guide was invaluable. It was the first essential layer of the human network. These weren't just paths, they were repositories of collective memory and experience. The search for specific resources, like jade from Khotan or horses from Fergana, began to delineate more purposeful, if still incredibly dangerous, corridors of movement. The Han dynasty's attempts to exert control and establish garrisons, while often brutal and self-serving, also inadvertently provided a degree of highly relative stability and infrastructure along certain key segments, particularly the Hexi corridor. These tentative footholds, these small pinpricks of imperial order, however contested, offered a slightly more predictable environment for future, more organized travel. It's like they were beta testing the world's first intercontinental highway system. Only the beta testers usually didn't get a thank you note, just if they were lucky. Survival. A significant mainstream historical fact is the remarkable persistence of many of the major trunk routes of the later Silk Road. For over 1,000 years, and in some cases much longer. Certain valleys, passes, and oasis chains remained the preferred, often only conduits for travel across Eurasia. This enduring pattern strongly suggests that the initial, often desperate geographical and human pathfinding accomplished during these earlier pre-Silk centuries was incredibly effective and fundamentally sound. They figured out the paths of least resistance, not just geographically, but often culturally too. Even the very limited exchange of those humble goods and nascent ideas laid a groundwork. It established the possibility of interaction. The faintest awareness that other societies, with different products and different ways of life, existed beyond the known horizon. Each small transaction, each misunderstood word translated, was a tiny step towards a more interconnected world. Historians still argue, of course, about the relative importance of various factors in this early phase. Was it primarily state-sponsored initiatives that pushed these boundaries, or the cumulative effect of countless small-scale private ventures and migrations? The truth, as always, is likely a complex blend. One quirky thought to ponder is how many of what later became known as sacred pilgrimage routes or well-trodden trade arteries might have begun as these simple, desperate survival paths. A track first blazed by a hunter following game, or a family fleeing drought, could, over generations, become a recognized route for traders, and then perhaps, as its origins faded into myth, be imbued with spiritual significance. The footprints of forgotten refugees might have paved the way for the sandals of future saints and the boots of future merchants. So, as you reflect on these really long walks, remember that every blister, every moment of fear, every mouthful of dust, every life tragically lost in the vastness, was, in an unseen and unintended way, a contribution. These were not the grand architects of the Silk Road, but its unwitting, unthanked, and often unwilling pioneers. They were the ones who first sketched the human lines across the blank spaces on the map, driven by the most fundamental of human impulses. Their individual stories are mostly lost to us, as ephemeral as footprints in the sand. But their collective journey, their sheer stubborn persistence in the face of unimaginable hardship, forged the initial essential connections upon which a world-changing network would eventually be built. They didn't know they were forging the future. They were just trying to survive the present. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy etched not in stone, but in the enduring memory of the pathways themselves. And now, as our long, long walk through those ancient, dusty landscapes draws to its close, as the echoes of those distant footsteps begin to fade, allow your own journey to slow. The biting winds of the high passes and the scorching breath of the desert give way to the gentle stillness of your own quiet space. The anxieties of the trail, the fear of the unknown, the constant vigilance can now recede, replaced by a sense of calm and tranquility. The harsh contours of the Taklamakan and the jagged peaks of the Pamirs soften into the comfortable landscape of your present moment. The desperate search for the next oasis, for that life-giving water, is over. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are home. Those ancient travelers, whose resilience we have marveled at, carried burdens almost unimaginable to us, driven by needs so fundamental, yet their enduring human spirit unknowingly paved the way for connections that would one day span the globe. Let the vastness of those ancient steppes and the profound silence of those empty deserts expand within your mind, not as a place of fear, but as a space of deep, quiet rest. Feel the tension leave your shoulders. Your limbs grow heavy and relaxed. The stories have been told, the journey completed. There is nothing more to do now, nothing more to see, except the gentle unfolding of your own peaceful dreams. Allow the soft cadence of these final words to guide you into a deep and untroubled sleep. Sweet dreams.